My name is Alice Patel, and at 29 years old, as a sergeant in the United States Army, I thought I understood what an enemy was. I was wrong. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one carrying a weapon, it's the one who carries your last name. I was sitting on the cold, hard oak floors of the first house I'd ever bought, paid for with nearly a decade of sweat, blood, and sleepless nights in places God had long forgotten, when my father called. His voice held no warmth, only the chilling efficiency of a command. Alice, your mother and I have discussed it. That house, it's better suited for Sabrina to start an art studio. You're in the Army, you can live on base. We're sending over the papers for you to sign the deed over. I was speechless. And then my mother took the phone, her voice sickly sweet. Honey, don't be so selfish. It was never really your money. It was always family money that you were just holding on to. They thought I would break. They didn't know they had just declared war on a U.S. Army sergeant. If you've ever had your sacrifices treated like a debt by the very people who were supposed to love you, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is for you. The peace I'd been chasing for 10 years finally found me in a quiet 2-bedroom house in Oak Haven, Texas. I was on leave, and the house was still mostly empty, filled only with meticulously labeled Army-issue packing boxes and the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. Just an hour ago, I'd finished assembling a bookshelf with my own 2 hands, the scent of pine and wood stain still clinging to my fingers. It was a good smell, an honest smell. I put on some George Strait. You can't live in Texas and not have George Strait playing when something good happens, and poured myself a tall glass of Southern-style sweet tea, the ice cubes clinking like tiny bells. I slid down to the floor, my back against a bare wall, and just looked. I surveyed my small kingdom. This wasn't just drywall and a foundation. These walls were built from sand-dusted deployments, lonely holidays in barracks thousands of miles from home, and every last cent of combat pay I had painstakingly saved. Every dollar was a memory, a sacrifice. I took a picture with my phone, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and sent it to my grandpa. "I'm really home now, Grandpa," I typed. A profound sense of pride and tranquility washed over me. It was a feeling I had craved for so long, a sweet, profound silence that only a soldier, finally off duty, can truly understand. It was the quiet after the storm. Or so I thought. The doorbell chimed, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the music. It was the mail carrier, holding a crisp, white certified mail envelope. My stomach tightened just a little. In my line of work, and in life really, certified mail rarely brings good news. The date on the postmark caught my eye. It was today's date, the exact anniversary of the day I enlisted. A bitter, ironic coincidence. I signed the little electronic pad he held out, my signature a bit shaky. When I saw the return address, a cold dread snaked its way up my spine. It was from a law firm representing Edward and Marlene Patel, my own parents. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. It wasn't a letter, it was a lawsuit. The typed words seemed to dance and blur before my eyes, each one a separate, brutal blow. Immediate transfer of property ownership. My breath hitched. Reimbursement for parental investment and upbringing totaling $300,000. The air in my lungs vanished, sucked out as if by a vacuum. Misappropriation of family assets. The house, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in. I read it again and again, hoping, praying that I'd gotten it wrong. But there was no mistake. My name, their names, the address of this very house. All there, in unforgiving black and white. My mind flashed back a few weeks to the video call, the one where I'd excitedly shown them my new home. I had been so blinded by my own joy that I'd missed all the warning signs. My mother, Marlene, had plastered on a tight, thin smile, her questions sharp and intrusive, all about the price, the mortgage terms, the down payment. My father, Edward, had just grunted something about how Army pay must be pretty good these days. But it was my sister Sabrina who had fired the first real shot. "Well," she'd said, her voice dripping with sarcastic envy, Must be nice, spending the taxpayers' money on stuff like this. Marlene had immediately jumped to her defense. My poor Sabrina is struggling every single day to follow her passion, while her sister? I'd brushed it off. I'd told myself it was just petty jealousy, the kind of small, harmless friction that exists in any family. But now, listening to those words echo in the silent house, they weren't small pricks of a needle anymore. They were calculated stabs from a knife that had been sharpened long ago. The lawsuit wasn't just a demand. It was an indictment of my entire life. A formal legal document accusing me of being ungrateful, selfish, and of using my military career to abandon familial obligations. But the final, devastating blow was an attachment stapled to the back. It was a printout of an email from Sabrina to our Aunt Ramona, the one bankrolling this entire nightmare. I read her words, and the floor fell out from under me. "She owes us," Sabrina had written. "She has the whole government backing her up, while I have nothing. That house should have been mine." I sank to the floor, the papers scattering from my numb fingers. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it was almost surreal. They didn't just want my house, they wanted to strip mine my life, to invalidate every sacrifice, to take ownership of my honor. They wanted to make me feel like I owed them for the very air I breathed. The George Strait song was still playing softly from my phone, a classic tune about love and heartbreak in Texas. But in the crushing silence of my brand new, empty home, it sounded like a funeral dirge. The battle I had been training for my whole life, it turned out, wasn't going to be fought overseas. It was going to be fought right here. And as I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of their treachery, a cold, hard question began to form in the wreckage of my heart. Why? After all the enemies I had faced, why were the ones who hurt me the most the very people who gave me life? The initial shock of the lawsuit eventually receded, but it didn't leave peace in its wake. It left a profound, hollow numbness. I spent the next hour wandering aimlessly through the empty rooms of my house, my boots echoing on the oak floors. It felt like walking through a crime scene. My crime scene. My hand, acting on some instinct I didn't understand, drifted to one of the olive-drab footlockers stamped with my name and rank, the one marked personal. Inside, beneath years of military challenge coins and neatly folded flags, was a smaller, wooden box. My past. My fingers, usually so steady, fumbled with the simple latch. The first thing I pulled out was a faded photograph. In it, a 10-year-old version of me grins at the camera, my face smudged with dirt, my softball uniform stained with the glory of a slide into home plate. In my hand, I'm holding a cheap, gold plastic trophy almost as big as my torso. The championship trophy. I remember that day so clearly. The sun was hot on my neck, the taste of victory sweet in my mouth. I ran all the way home, bursting with the need to show my parents, to make them proud. But when I burst through the door, breathless and beaming, the scene in the living room stopped me cold. My parents were huddled around Sabrina on the couch. She was sobbing dramatically because her latest painting hadn't been chosen for the school's art fair. My trophy, my hard-won victory, was met with a dismissive glance. My mother patted my head without really looking at me. "Honey, that's nice," she'd said, her focus entirely on my sister. "Winning is easy. It's learning to deal with disappointment that's hard. Your sister needs us right now." And just like that, my moment was over. Even in victory, I was secondary. My success was quiet and expected. Her failure was a 5-alarm fire that required all hands on deck. My fingers brushed against another memory. A folded dinner napkin. The dinner. I was 18. We were all sitting at the dining room table when Sabrina, with the flair of a Broadway actress, announced she was going to a private, wildly expensive art school in another state. My parents erupted in applause, their faces glowing with a pride I had never seen directed at me. My father, Edward, raised his glass. "That's my girl. You follow that passion, you hear? We'll take care of whatever it costs." A few minutes later, after their excitement died down, I took a deep breath. "I've made a decision too," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm enlisting in the army." The silence that fell over the table was heavy, suffocating. My father slowly placed his fork down on his plate. The small clink of metal against ceramic was as loud as a gunshot. He looked at me, not with pride, but with a kind of baffled disgust, as if I'd just announced I was joining the circus. "The army?" he said, his voice laced with contempt. That's for kids who don't have other options, Alice. We're not that kind of family." They spent tens of thousands of dollars on Sabrina's passion, on an art degree she never even used. But I remember them complaining about the price of gas to drive to my basic training graduation. It wasn't about the money. It was about the narrative. Sabrina was the artist, the dreamer. I was the fallback plan, the sensible, unglamorous investment that was never supposed to be the main story. Digging deeper in the box, my hand closed around a smooth, heavy medallion. My fingers traced the raised seal of the state of Texas, the State Science Fair. I was 16. That memory still stings the most. My project, a low-cost water filtration system I'd spent almost a year developing, had won first place. The grand prize. The award ceremony was a huge deal, held in a massive auditorium in Austin. That same day, Sabrina decided to hang a few of her canvases on the wall of a local coffee shop and called it her debut gallery exhibition. I had pleaded with them. "Please, just come for an hour," I'd begged my mom on the phone. "This is the biggest thing that's ever happened to me." I could hear her sigh, a sound I knew all too well. It was the sound of my needs becoming an inconvenience. She stroked my hair when I got home, but her eyes looked past me, already focused on her other daughter. "Oh, Alice," she'd said softly. "Your sister is so sensitive. This debut could make or break her spirit. Your award is from the government. Your sister's passion, that needs to be nurtured by family." That night, I stood on a brightly lit stage and heard my name called. I walked to the podium, shook the hand of a state representative, and accepted my award. And I looked out at the audience, at the 2 empty seats in the 3rd row where my parents were supposed to be. The pride of my achievement was instantly hollowed out, replaced by a cold, sharp loneliness that took my breath away. Sitting there on the floor of my new house, the cold wood seeping through my jeans, surrounded by these ghosts of the past, a terrible, clarifying thought settled over me. This lawsuit wasn't a sudden act of greed. It was the culmination of a lifetime of this. It was the final bill for a childhood where I was always the safe bet, the emotional and financial ATM, while Sabrina was the passion project that required endless, unconditional funding. Every achievement, every sacrifice, every ounce of my discipline was not just overlooked. It was expected. It was my duty. If you were the responsible one, the one who was just expected to succeed without any fanfare while your siblings got all the attention, hit that like button. And if you know what it feels like to have your biggest accomplishments met with empty chairs, just comment the words, "I see you," below. So I know I'm not alone. They weren't suing me because they needed the money. They were suing me because, for the first time in my life, I had built something that was entirely mine. A fortress they couldn't control. And in their eyes, for the child who was never supposed to have needs of her own, that was the ultimate act of betrayal. And in my hand, I was still holding the award from that night, a symbol of my greatest victory and my most profound loneliness. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a map that showed me exactly how I got here. I didn't sleep that night. Soldiers learn to function without sleep. But this was different. This wasn't the alert readiness of a mission. It was the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a soul under siege. The map of my past, laid bare by the contents of that wooden box, left no room for tears. Tears were a luxury, a surrender. And as the first hint of dawn crept over the Texas horizon, my training took over. 500 hours. My body woke itself, a clockwork of ingrained discipline. But instead of putting on my uniform, I pulled on running shorts and a worn-out PT shirt. I started cleaning the empty house. I wasn't nesting, I was thinking. With every sweep of the broom, every wipe of a dusty windowsill, I was clearing the emotional chaos from my head, organizing my thoughts into a plan of action. I converted the empty dining room into my tactical operations center, a war room. I taped a large map of Texas to the wall, using pushpins to mark the key positions. My home in Oak Haven, my parents' house in the Dallas suburbs, and my grandpa's small town down in the hill country. My enemy's location, and my only known ally. My weapons weren't rifles and grenades. They were stacks of paper I pulled from my footlocker. I laid them out on the floor with military precision. 9 years of leave and earning statements. The Army's version of a pay stub, showing every single dollar I'd ever earned. My deployment orders to Afghanistan and other garden spots around the world. Bank statements, emails, text messages. Each document was a round of ammunition. The gnawing pain of the night before had hardened into a cold, steely resolve. I wouldn't fight this battle with tears. I would fight it like a soldier. I would fight it with facts. But a soldier with ammunition and no fire support is in a world of trouble. The stark reality of my situation hit me when I started calling civilian law firms in Killeen and Austin. I sat on the floor, a legal pad on my knee, and listened as one lawyer after another, in calm, professional tones, explained their retainer fees. The numbers they quoted were staggering. $10,000, $25,000. One firm specializing in contentious family disputes quoted a $50,000 retainer just to get started. The potential costs, they said, could run into the hundreds of thousands. The very money they were trying to take from me was the money I needed to defend myself. It was a perfect trap, a financial vice grip designed to make me fold. After the 5th phone call, I hung up and just sat there, the phone heavy in my hand. A wave of helplessness washed over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my first firefight. It was the sickening realization that you are completely and utterly outgunned. They knew. They knew I wouldn't have the resources to fight them professionally. They were counting on it. But then, a lifetime of discipline kicked back in. A quote from the old soldier's manual echoed in my head: adapt and overcome. Being outgunned doesn't mean you surrender. It means you fight smarter. I got in my truck and drove to Fort Cavazos. The post was a familiar world of order and purpose. I walked into the JAG office, the Judge Advocate General's Corps. It was a simple, unassuming brick building, nothing like the fancy high-rise offices of the civilian lawyers I'd spoken to. But I knew this building housed some of the sharpest legal minds in the military. A young captain, a lawyer with tired eyes but a sharp uniform, listened patiently as I laid out my situation. He reviewed the lawsuit, his expression growing more and more grim with every page he turned. When he finished, he looked up and shook his head slowly. "Sergeant Patel, I'm very sorry," he said, and my heart sank. "We can't represent you. This is a civil matter, outside our jurisdiction." The last flicker of hope I had began to die. But then he leaned forward. "However," he continued, his voice lowering, "what I'm looking at here is a frivolous and harassing lawsuit. The reimbursement for upbringing costs claim is absolutely ludicrous. It won't hold up in any Texas court." He tapped the document with his pen. "My official advice is to seek civilian counsel. My unofficial advice, you can do this yourself. Pro se." That was the legal term for self-representation. "You're a Sergeant Patel," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You know how to assemble a briefing book. You know how to present facts clearly and concisely. Do that. Organize your evidence chronologically. Stick to the facts. Don't let emotion get in the way. Let the numbers and the documents tell the story for you." He printed out a list of free legal aid services for veterans and active duty military. It wasn't an army of lawyers, but it was a map. And a map was more than I'd had an hour ago. That evening, I was too physically and emotionally drained to even think about cooking. My dinner was a soldier's dinner. I tore open an MRE, a meal, ready to eat, that I still had in my go bag. Chicken tetrazzini. I sat on the cold floor of my empty house, eating the bland, lukewarm meal straight from its olive drab pouch with a plastic spork. I looked around at the walls of the home I was fighting for, the silence broken only by the crinkling of the MRE bag. The loneliness was crushing. It was heavier than my pack, heavier than my body armor. I was used to eating in the controlled chaos of the DFAC, the dining facility, surrounded by the shouts and laughter of my platoon, my comrades. Here, there was only silence. The silence of a war being fought entirely on my own. And in that moment, eating that soldier's meal in the middle of my empty fortress, I realized something. I could have all the strategy, all the facts, all the discipline in the world. But no soldier wins a war alone. I needed my unit. Not the transactional family unit my mother always talked about. I needed my real unit. The one that had my back. The morning after my visit to the JAG office, I was sitting at my makeshift command center, staring at the mountain of paperwork, when my phone rang. For a heart-stopping second, I thought it was them. But the screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in a while. A name that always brought a sense of quiet comfort. Grandpa. His voice, gravelly from years of shouting over the roar of helicopter blades in Vietnam, was as steady as a rock. "Alice," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I heard what happened. Now don't you say a word. You just listen to your old grandpa for a minute." I listened, the phone pressed hard against my ear, my knuckles white. "Your grandmother, God rest her soul, she always knew what your father was. He's a weak man, Alice, always has been, easily led by the nose by your mother and his eldest girl. This fight you're in, it ain't yours alone." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Now, you send me a copy of that lawsuit. I've got a few things in the old shed that might just be useful." And for the first time in days, I cried. It wasn't the hot, angry tears of betrayal, but something else entirely. It was a flood of sheer, unadulterated relief. A dam I didn't even know I'd built inside me just broke, and the sobs that came out were ragged, shuddering breaths that seemed to pull the tension from every muscle in my body. The physical weight on my chest, the one that had made it hard to breathe since I'd opened that envelope, finally lifted. I wasn't completely alone. There was one person in my family, my real family, who was still in my corner. A few days later, still wading through legal jargon, I was in the DFAC, pushing some sad-looking Salisbury steak around my plate. The dining facility was a familiar chaos of noise, the clatter of trays, the scrape of chairs, hundreds of conversations echoing off the cinder block walls. But in my head, it was completely silent. I was isolated in my own private war. That's when my platoon sergeant, Master Sergeant Mike Chen, sat down across from me. "You look like hell, Patel," he said, not unkindly. "What's going on?" I hesitated. My training, my entire career, was built on a simple principle. Handle your own problems. Don't be a burden. Your personal life stops at the gate. But looking at Mike's genuinely concerned face, the carefully constructed walls I'd put up just crumbled. The words just came out. I told him everything, my voice low and halting, trying to keep it factual, professional. I wasn't looking for sympathy, just maybe a piece of advice from a senior NCO I respected. Mike listened, his fork resting untouched on his tray. He didn't interrupt. He just stared at a fixed point on the wall behind me, his expression hardening with every word I said. When I was done, the silence stretched for a moment. He just nodded slowly, then met my eyes. "Okay, Sergeant, eat your lunch." I thought that was the end of it, a quiet acknowledgement. I felt a pang of disappointment, thinking maybe I'd misread him. But it wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning. That Saturday evening, as the Texas sun began to dip below the horizon, a convoy of pickup trucks, big Ford F-150s and Chevy Silverados, pulled up in front of my house. I was watching from the window, my heart initially jumping into my throat, before I saw Mike Chen hop out of the lead truck. He was followed by what looked like my entire platoon. They weren't empty-handed. They were hauling a massive smoker on a trailer, coolers filled with what I knew was Shiner Bock beer, huge, vacuum-sealed slabs of Texas brisket, and stacks of pizzas for, as they put it, the non-believers. Mike grinned, tipping his battered baseball cap as he walked up my driveway. "Sergeant Patel," he announced loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "We heard your perimeter was vulnerable. Your unit has arrived to fortify your position." That afternoon, my quiet, lonely backyard was transformed into a bustling forward operating base and a full-blown Texas barbecue. While the incredible smell of slow-smoked mesquite and beef filled the air, my soldiers got to work. They moved with the quiet efficiency of a well-trained unit, a symphony of purposeful action. A team started installing a state-of-the-art security camera system, running wires with practiced ease. Another group was changing out all the exterior locks for heavy-duty deadbolts. A third was repairing the section of my fence that had been leaning, their hammers ringing out in a steady, reassuring rhythm. The oppressive silence of the house was replaced by the sounds of power drills, friendly trash talk, and roaring laughter. An older neighbor, an Air Force vet named Henderson from across the street, saw the commotion and came over with a big bowl of potato salad and a few stories about his time in Saigon. I stood on my back porch, a cold beer in my hand, and just watched them. I watched these men and women, my comrades, my soldiers, turn my house from a cold, empty battlefield into a warm, protected fortress. My fortress. They didn't ask a lot of nosy questions. They didn't offer empty platitudes. They just showed up. They acted. That was the currency they dealt in. Action. As night fell, we all sat around in lawn chairs, the new security lights they'd installed casting a warm, safe glow over the yard. We ate brisket so tender it melted on slices of plain white bread, the smoke clinging to our clothes. And we shared stories. Nobody mentioned the lawsuit. Not once. Instead, I listened as one of the younger privates told a hilarious story about a misadventure with a camel on his last deployment. I heard two of my sergeants debating the Dallas Cowboys' chances this year. It was a silent, powerful show of support. It was them saying, without saying a word, "We are your wall." They weren't just protecting my house, they were protecting me. When it was time for them to leave, long after dark, Mike clapped me on the shoulder. "We're always a phone call away, you hear me?" he said, his voice serious. "Nobody messes with one of our own." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept. I really slept. A deep, dreamless sleep in my own bed, in my own house. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for weeks had finally loosened its grip. I wasn't just a soldier in a house anymore. I was a person in a home, guarded by the unwavering loyalty of the family I had chosen for myself. The peace I had found, the sense of safety built by my platoon, lasted for about 72 hours. It turns out that when you're dealing with toxic people, silence isn't a deterrent, it's an accelerant. My refusal to engage, to plead, to even acknowledge them, didn't make them back down. It just made them angrier. Sabrina launched the first assault, not with a lawsuit, but with a weapon far more insidious in the modern age: a social media post. She chose a photo of the two of us from years ago, a forced smile Christmas picture where we were wearing matching sweaters. The caption she wrote beneath it was a masterclass in manipulative sympathy. It was a long, rambling narrative, filled with fake tears, about the unbearable pain of watching a loved one become brainwashed by military culture. She wrote that I had become a hollowed-out machine, incapable of empathy, a person who valued property over family. She painted a picture of our parents as heartbroken saints who had sacrificed everything, only to be cast aside by their ungrateful soldier daughter. The post spread like wildfire. My Aunt Ramona and my parents' entire circle from their church in Dallas shared it with sanctimonious comments like, "Praying for you all, and the military changes people, and not for the better." Soon my phone started buzzing with notifications. Messages from distant cousins and old family friends I hadn't spoken to in years, all scolding me, calling me a disgrace, a heartless child. They were meticulously crafting a narrative, casting me as the villain in my own life story. And from hundreds of miles away, they were succeeding. The psychological warfare then escalated from digital to physical. Aunt Ramona started making daily pilgrimages past my house. Her old beige sedan would cruise down my quiet suburban street at a snail's pace, her head turned, her eyes locked on my front door. It was a blatant act of intimidation, a silent vehicular threat that screamed, "We're watching you." The cameras my unit had installed recorded every pass, time-stamping her sad little parade of passive aggression. But even with the evidence, the feeling of being violated, of being stalked, was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. My physical perimeter was secure, but my mental perimeter was under constant attack. One evening, I was sitting on my front porch, trying to enjoy the Texas twilight, when I saw her car again. This time, she didn't just drive by. She pulled over to the curb at the end of the street, killed the engine, and just sat there in the growing darkness. A shadow in a shadow. She didn't get out, she just watched. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was no longer just a family squabble, this was something uglier, something obsessive. But the most dangerous attack, the one that went straight for the jugular, came from a direction I never anticipated. One afternoon at work, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple and chilling. Meeting with the commanding officer. My heart hammered against my ribs. You don't get summoned by the CO for a pat on the back. I walked into the colonel's office, stood at attention, and reported. He was a seasoned officer, a man who had seen combat and commanded thousands of soldiers. He had a reputation for being tough, but fair. Today, his face was an unreadable mask of authority. Sergeant Patel, he began, his voice devoid of warmth. We received an anonymous phone call this morning from a concerned family member. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. This individual expressed grave concerns about your mental stability and your ability to manage your finances. The air in the room seemed to turn to ice. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about the house anymore. This was a direct strike at my security clearance, my career, my entire identity. In the military, a question about your mental stability isn't just an insult. It's a potential career-ending threat. They weren't just trying to take my home. They were trying to burn down everything I had built. I took a single, steadying breath. My body locked into the familiar posture of a soldier being addressed by a superior. I did not panic. I did not make excuses. I did not let a single tear form. I delivered a battlefield report. Sir, I said, my voice as level as I could make it. I am currently the target of a harassing, frivolous lawsuit filed by my parents. They are attempting to take ownership of a home I purchased with my own income. I laid out the facts concisely, chronologically, without emotion. I told him about the social media campaign, the stalking by my aunt, and I told him I had video evidence and documentation for every single one of my claims. The colonel listened, his fingers steepled under his chin, not interrupting once. He was a man trained to read people, to detect deception, to assess threats. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes boring into mine. Then, he nodded slowly. I see, Sergeant, he said, the ice in his voice cracking. This is a blatant attempt to weaponize my chain of command against one of my own soldiers. It is, to be frank, despicable. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not just a commander, but a man who understood. This inquiry goes no further than this office, Sergeant Patel. Your career here is secure. Your record is unblemished. Now you go back to work, and you focus on winning your fight. If they try to pull a stunt like this again, you come directly to me. Understood? Yes, sir, I said, my voice thick with a mixture of emotions. I walked out of that office, and the moment the door clicked shut behind me, the relief that washed over me was so intense my knees felt weak. But it was immediately followed by something else. A cold, hard, clarifying rage. They had tried to destroy me. They had used the very institution I had dedicated my life to as a weapon against me. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had declared total war. And I was done being on the defensive. The rage that had solidified in the colonel's office was a cold, heavy thing in my gut. It stayed with me for the last few days of my leave, a constant companion. My time was running out, and before heading back to the disciplined world of Fort Cavazos, I needed to face the mundane reality of an empty refrigerator. That's how I found myself under the fluorescent lights of a crowded H-E-B supermarket, my mind still a whirlwind from the meeting that had almost cost me my career. I was just trying to get through my shopping list, to focus on the simple choices between brands of coffee and types of bread. I was in the checkout line, the familiar beeps of the scanners and the low chatter of other shoppers creating a normal, everyday soundtrack. I was almost there, almost safe. Then I heard it. A voice that was engineered for condescension, dripping with a familiar, cloying sweetness that always preceded an attack. Well, look what we have here. Must be nice, doing your grocery shopping with that big government paycheck, huh? My blood turned to ice. I didn't have to look. I knew that voice better than my own. Sabrina. She was a few lines over, standing with Aunt Ramona, her voice pitched just loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. Her face was a perfect mask of smug provocation. My training kicked in immediately. A voice in my head, calm and detached, started issuing orders. Do not engage Patel. Maintain situational awareness. You are a staff sergeant in the United States Army. Be professional. I turned my head away, pretending I hadn't heard, and pushed my cart forward a few inches. Just ignore them. They feed on attention. Starve them out. But Sabrina was never one to be ignored. I felt a presence beside me, and suddenly, my cart jolted to a stop. She had stepped in front of it, her hand gripping the metal bar, blocking my path. Aunt Ramona stood just behind her, a scowl etched on her face, arms crossed like a cartoon villain's henchman. What's the matter, little sister? Sabrina sneered, her smile a predatory slash. Nothing to say to me. Mom and Dad are just heartbroken, you know. They sacrificed everything for you, and you repay them by trying to steal the house that should have been mine. The words were absurd, a complete inversion of reality, but they were working. A woman in line behind me shifted her weight, her eyes darting between us. The cashier paused, her hand hovering over a carton of milk. We were becoming a spectacle. I clenched my jaw so hard I felt a muscle jump. My voice came out low, dangerously calm. Sabrina, this is not the time or the place for this. Move out of my way. Aunt Ramona scoffed loudly. Oh, she's scared, she announced to the checkout line at large. She knows she's in the wrong. What kind of daughter sues her own parents? It's a disgrace to this family. The pressure was building inside my chest, a physical thing, hot and suffocating. But it was Sabrina's next words, hissed directly into my face, that finally detonated the years of compressed rage. Who do you think you are? She spat, her eyes narrowed with a jealousy so potent it was almost visible. You're just a lucky grunt, a nobody who got a free ride. You've never accomplished a single thing on your own. Everything you have is because of this family. That house is Mom and Dad's money, not yours. And that was it. The final straw. The one insult too many. The absolute, categorical denial of every sacrifice, every drop of sweat, every lonely night. Every moment I had risked everything in a faraway desert while she was at home, living off an allowance. I looked into my sister's eyes, and something inside me, some carefully constructed wall of discipline I had spent a decade building, didn't just crack. It vaporized. The calm, professional soldier was gone, and in her place was a woman who had been pushed past her breaking point. My hand shot out, and I shoved her arm off my cart with a force that made her stumble back. A collective gasp went through the checkout area. You listen to me, I snarled, and the voice that came out was not my own. It was my command voice, the one that cut through the noise of the battlefield, and it made the entire section of the store fall silent. I have spent nearly 10 years of my life serving this country. I have missed holidays. I have missed birthdays. I have missed watching my friends get married and have children. I nearly missed coming home at all from a roadside bomb in Afghanistan so that you, I jabbed a finger in her direction, could stay home, live off Mom and Dad, and play pretend with your art. That house? I bought it with my combat pay. I bought it with sleepless nights on a cot in the middle of nowhere. I bought it with a loneliness so deep you couldn't possibly comprehend it. It is mine. I turned, my eyes locking onto Aunt Ramona, who had shrunk back, her face pale. And the two of you. My voice dropped to a lethal hiss. You will stay away from me. You will stay away from my house. The game is over. I'll see you in court. Without another word, I turned my back on my shopping cart full of groceries. I left it all right there. I walked, my back ramrod straight, through the silent checkout line, past the stunned faces of the other customers. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, but for the first time, I didn't care what they thought. I cared what I thought. If you've ever had that one moment, that one final straw where you finally stood up and said, enough is enough, I want you to support this moment for me. Hit that like button, and if you know that feeling, comment with a single word. Finally. Let me know you were standing there with me. I pushed through the automatic doors of the HEB and into the blinding Texas sun, leaving the wreckage of my old life behind me. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a soldier going to war. The fury from the supermarket didn't just fade away. It settled inside me, cooling and hardening into something new. It was no longer a wild, explosive force. It was fuel. I drove back to my house not in a state of emotional turmoil, but with the cold, clear-headed focus of a soldier who had just received new mission parameters. The objective had changed. This was no longer about defense. This was about a counteroffensive. I walked back into my dining room, my self-designated command center, with a renewed sense of purpose. This was Operations Center 2.0. Before, I had been organizing evidence to protect myself. Now, I was marshaling assets for an attack. I took down the simple map and replaced it with a large white erase board I'd bought that afternoon. With a black marker, I began to diagram the entire battlefield. I drew boxes for my parents, for Sabrina, for Aunt Ramona, connecting them with lines that represented financial flows and emotional manipulation. It was an intelligence analysis, the kind I'd been trained to do for enemy networks in a war zone. I listed their strengths, their arrogance, their willingness to lie, and then I listed their weaknesses, their lack of actual evidence, their emotional instability, and their greed. I was no longer a heartbroken daughter wading through painful memories. I was a strategist, identifying the enemy's center of gravity. And I knew I needed more firepower. My first call was to my cousin, Thomas. He was a few years older, a former Marine who now ran a successful construction business in San Antonio. We weren't close, but we shared a bond forged in the same dysfunctional extended family. He answered on the second ring. "Thomas," I said, dispensing with pleasantries. "It's Alice. I need your help. Uncle Edward and Aunt Marlene are at it again. This time, it's me they're coming after." There was no surprise in his voice, only a weary sigh of recognition. "Let me guess," he said, his voice flat. "Sabrina has a once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity, and you're the family investor who's supposed to fund it." I was stunned into silence for a second. "How did you know?" "Because they tried the same thing with me when I got out of the Corps," he explained. "They wanted $100,000 for some art collective she was starting. Used the same lines on me. Family duty. Supporting the arts. When I told them my savings were for my own business, they told the whole family I was a selfish bastard who forgot where he came from. They don't change, Alice. They just find a new target. They're suing me for my house, Thomas, claiming they paid for it." "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Listen, I'll do whatever you need. You want me to write it all down? A sworn affidavit detailing their little pitch to me? You got it. It's time someone put a stop to their game." His words were a bullet in my arsenal. His testimony wasn't just a story, it was proof of a pattern, a systematic history of financial predation disguised as family obligation. A few days later, a large, heavy box arrived from my grandfather. I sliced it open. There was no letter, no card, just stacks and stacks of manila folders organized with the meticulous precision of a Marine Corps quartermaster, and a single, handwritten note on top. It said, "The truth doesn't need a speech." I spent the entire afternoon on the floor, surrounded by the contents of that box. It was a treasure trove. It was Pandora's box, and my grandfather had just handed me the key. There were copies of my parents' bank statements going back 15 years, showing regular, substantial money transfers to Sabrina's account, labeled everything from art supplies to living expenses. There were their tax returns, where they had claimed Sabrina as a dependent well into her late 20s, a blatant act of fraud. There were copies of rental agreements for apartments in Dallas that they had paid for in full. Every document was a nail in their coffin. But the final, most shocking piece of evidence was at the bottom of the box. It was a notarized loan agreement between my parents and Aunt Ramona for a significant amount of money. The repayment terms were vague, but the debt was clear. And suddenly, it all made sense. Aunt Ramona wasn't just a loyal sister backing up my parents. She was a debtor, and this lawsuit wasn't just about helping Sabrina get a house. It was her way of paying back her loan without spending a dime. With these new weapons in hand, I spent the last few days of my leave preparing for court. My dining room table looked like a war room before a major operation. I bought a thick 3-ring binder and filled it with plastic sleeves, organizing every single piece of paper into tabbed sections. Plaintiff's proof of income, Alice P. Financial support history, Sabrina P. Sworn affidavit, Thomas R. Debt agreement, Ramona E. I cross-referenced bank statements with tax documents. I printed out stills from the security footage of Aunt Ramona's drive-bys. I transcribed the audio from the confrontation at the HEB. I thought about Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of World War II, a small-town Texas boy who faced impossible odds on the battlefield and won through sheer grit and courage. This was my battlefield. My honor was on the line. I wrote down every question I would ask each of them. I rehearsed my opening and closing statements in front of the mirror, training my voice to be calm, steady, and devoid of emotion. Let the facts speak for themselves. When the day came to drive back to Fort Cavazos, the fear that had been my constant shadow was gone. In its place was a hard, cold readiness. I had done my reconnaissance. I had gathered my intelligence. I had my battle plan. I put the heavy binder on the passenger seat of my truck. It was my weapon. It was time to go to war. The morning of the hearing, I didn't feel fear. I felt the same cold, sharp focus that settles over you before a mission. I put on my Army service uniform, the formal Class A uniform. The dark blue jacket, the perfectly creased slacks, the polished brass, and the colorful ribbons on my chest. They weren't a costume. They were my armor. They were a reminder, to myself and to everyone in that room, of exactly who I was and what I had earned. I walked into the Bell County Courthouse in Belton, Texas, with my heavy binder tucked under my arm. My grandfather was already there, sitting in the back row. He gave me a single, firm nod. That was all I needed. My family, on the other hand, had prepared for a theatrical performance. Their lawyer, a slick man in an overpriced suit, had them arranged perfectly. My mother, Marlene, was dressed in morning black, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. My father, Edward, sat stiffly, the very picture of an offended patriarch. And Sabrina, she looked like a tragic artist, her expression a carefully crafted mix of indignation and pain. Their lawyer began with a soliloquy, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He spoke of the broken heart of a loving mother, the sacred duty of a child, and painted a picture of me as a cold, unfeeling soldier, hardened by war and disconnected from her roots. Through it all, I sat at my table, alone. My back was straight. My hands were folded calmly over my binder. I looked at no one but the judge. Her name was Judge Eleanor Vance. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression that told you she had seen it all. She listened to their lawyer's performance without a flicker of emotion. Then, it was my turn. "Ms. Patel," the judge said, her voice neutral. "You are representing yourself. You may present your case." I stood up, my movements economical and precise. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform. I simply stated facts. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady. "The plaintiffs claim that this house was a family asset funded by them. I am here to present evidence to the contrary." I opened my binder. Exhibit A, my leave and earning statements for the past 9 years. I placed a thick stack of official documents on the clerk's desk. These reports show, in detail, every single dollar deposited into my savings account. They show that this income was derived exclusively from my Army salary and my combat and deployment entitlements, much of which was earned while serving overseas in hostile environments. I turned to my father. "Mr. Patel," I said, addressing him formally, "could you please point out to the court any financial contribution from you or Mrs. Patel into this account?" He sputtered, looking helplessly at his lawyer. "Well, we raised her. We provided for her." I cut him off, my voice still level. "The question, sir, is about direct financial contributions to the purchase of this property. Is there any?" No, he mumbled, shrinking in his chair. I turned to my mother. Mrs. Patel, you stated in your deposition that this house was a family asset. In the state of Texas, assets are defined by legal documents. Do you have any such document, a deed, a title, a contract, that lists your name in relation to this property? Marlene burst into performative tears. Family doesn't need paperwork, she cried. It's about love and trust. So the answer is no, I stated flatly, turning back to the judge. The most damning part of the trial was Sabrina. She took the stand with an air of artistic superiority. I walked toward her, my footsteps echoing in the silent room. Ms. Patel, I began, you've stated that you intended to use this property as an art studio. Could you please present to the court your business plan for this studio? She looked confused. A business plan? It was to be a creative space, a place to inspire. I see, I continued. And what capital did you have to launch and sustain this business? For supplies, marketing, utilities? Sabrina actually pouted. Well, I assumed Alice would handle that part. She's always been good with the numbers, and she has that steady government money. A low murmur went through the courtroom. I saw her lawyer physically cringe and sink lower in his chair, covering his face with his hand. In one sentence, my sister had just admitted to the entire motivation behind the lawsuit. It was a hostile takeover, a plan to expropriate my life savings to fund her fantasies. It was time to end it. Your Honor, I said, returning to my table, I would like to present my final exhibits. I lifted the stacks of documents my grandfather had given me. Exhibit C, 15 years of the plaintiff's bank records showing over $150,000 in direct payments to Ms. Sabrina Patel for non-essential living expenses. Exhibit D, their tax returns, where they illegally claimed an adult woman in her late 20s as a dependent. And finally, Exhibit E, a notarized loan agreement between the plaintiffs and their primary witness, Ms. Ramona Evans, showing a substantial outstanding debt. I let the weight of the papers thud onto the table. This lawsuit was never about a house. It was about enabling a pattern of financial dependency, and it was a scheme to repay a personal debt using my assets. I sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Vance looked down at the evidence I had presented. She then slowly took off her glasses, polishing them with a cloth. When she looked up, her gaze was fixed on my family, and it was as hard as granite. I have been on this bench for 30 years, she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. And I have never seen such a frivolous, manipulative, and frankly, disgusting abuse of the legal process. She looked directly at me for a fraction of a second, and in her eyes I saw not pity, but a profound and weary understanding. This court is not a tool for settling petty jealousies and entitled demands. This lawsuit is not only baseless, it is an insult to the service of this staff sergeant. She picked up her gavel. Case dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiffs will bear the entirety of all associated court costs. Bang! The sound of the gavel was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of freedom. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. As I calmly packed my binder, I heard my mother's voice, no longer crying, but shrieking with pure rage. You are no daughter of mine. You hear me? You are nothing to us now. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I closed the binder, tucked it under my arm, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of my old family behind. My grandfather was waiting for me in the hallway, his face etched with a quiet, powerful pride. The war was over. I had won. The victory in the courtroom wasn't a clean, sweet triumph. I drove home from Belton with my grandfather, the heavy binder sitting on the back seat like a captured enemy standard. I felt a profound sense of relief, but underneath it was a bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried me through the hearing drained away, leaving a hollow space in its wake. I had won the battle, but the war had cost me my family. The victory was bittersweet. That evening, Grandpa stayed with me. He must have sensed that I couldn't bear to be alone in the silent, echoing house. We didn't talk much. He went out and came back with a bucket of Popeye's fried chicken and a carton of coleslaw. We sat out on the back porch, on the simple wooden steps, eating straight from the box as the Texas sky faded from a bruised purple to a blanket of impossibly bright stars. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. He just sat with me, a quiet, solid presence in the darkness. He told me stories about my grandmother, about how she could always see the steel in me, even when I was a little girl who was afraid of thunderstorms. "She would have been so proud of you today, Alice," he said, his voice raspy. "You did the right thing. And the right thing is almost never the easy thing." His words were a balm, a quiet affirmation that I wasn't alone in this strange new grief. But the enemy, I soon learned, does not accept defeat gracefully. Their silence lasted only a few days. The first aftershock came digitally. Sabrina, unable to attack me legally, turned to the court of public opinion. She created a GoFundMe page, complete with a tearful, out-of-focus photo of my parents. The title was, "Help Our Parents Rebuild After Betrayal." The page was a masterpiece of fiction, weaving a tale of a grateful, loving daughter who went off to the army, got brainwashed, and came back a cold-hearted monster who threw her elderly parents out of their home. It was filled with lies about how they'd poured their life savings into my success, only to be abandoned in their time of need. It was disgusting, and thanks to their church network and sympathetic friends, it started gaining traction. The true escalation, however, was not digital. It was visceral. One morning, I woke up early to go for a run. As I opened my front door, I froze. Scrawled across the clean white paint in hideous, dripping red spray paint was a single word: traitor. I stood there, staring at it. The security camera footage was sickeningly clear. At 2 a.m, a familiar sedan had pulled up. Aunt Ramona, her face twisted with a pathetic rage, had gotten out and vandalized my home. I watched the footage, but I didn't feel the fear or the hurt I expected. The numbness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. This was no longer about a lawsuit. This was a desecration. They had physically breached the walls of my fortress. They had crossed every conceivable line. I didn't hesitate. I drove back to the Bell County Courthouse that same morning. This time, I wasn't defending myself. I was on the attack. I walked into the clerk's office and filed a petition for a permanent restraining order against my father, my mother, my sister, and my aunt. At the hearing, it was just me and them. They couldn't afford a lawyer this time. They tried to defend themselves with the same emotional theatrics. My mother crying about her troubled daughter, Sabrina talking about family disputes. But there is no emotional defense against a high-definition video. I presented the security footage of the vandalism. I presented screenshots of the fraudulent GoFundMe page. I presented a sworn statement from my neighbor who had been woken up by my aunts shouting in the middle of the night. The evidence was undeniable. The judge, a different one this time, but with the same weary expression, granted the order immediately. 500 yards, no phone calls, no emails, no social media contact, no third-party messages. It was a legal wall, a fortress of law that they could not breach. Driving away from the courthouse for the second and final time, I felt a true, profound sense of release. I had cut the toxic cord. As we got on the highway heading back to Oak Haven, my grandfather reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a long, yellowed envelope. "Your grandmother told me to give you this when you truly needed it," he said, handing it to me. "I think now's the time." I pulled over to the shoulder of the road and opened it. Inside was her last will and testament, and a handwritten note. She had left me a small inheritance, nothing life-changing, but it was locked away in a trust fund that my parents could never touch. The note read, "For my strong girl, to build a life of your own, where no one can ever tell you that you owe them a thing." Tears streamed down my face as I read her familiar handwriting. It was a message from the past, a final act of protection. She had known. She had always known. And she had made sure I would never be alone. Sitting there, on the side of a Texas highway, I realized I hadn't just been fighting for a house. I had been fighting for the future my grandmother had always believed I deserved. And I had been honoring the legacy of the one woman who had seen me, truly seen me, all along. A year can feel like a lifetime. The person who bought this house is not the same one who lives in it now. A year ago, this place was a fortress, built to withstand a siege. Today, it's a sanctuary. The first thing you'd notice is the laughter. It fills the spaces where silence once echoed. My promotion to staff sergeant came through 6 months ago, and with it came a sense of solidified purpose. But the real change wasn't in the stripes on my uniform, it was in the life I was building within these walls. The garage, once a sterile space for storing military gear, is now a functioning woodshop. The scent of sawdust and pine has replaced the smell of canvas and grease. Most weekends, you can find me and my grandfather in there, covered in a fine layer of dust, working on our biggest project yet, a massive 10-foot-long dining table. We're building it from solid oak, designed to last for generations. It's big enough to seat 10 people comfortably. "We're gonna need it," Grandpa said one afternoon, running his hand over the smooth, sanded wood, a twinkle in his eye. "Your family keeps getting bigger." He was right. My family, my real family, had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. They were the men and women from my platoon, who now saw my house as a second home base. They were my cousin Thomas and his wife and kids, who drove down from Fort Worth once a month. They were my elderly Air Force veteran neighbor who brought over the best potato salad in Texas and stories that could make you cry with laughter. On Sundays in the fall, the backyard is a sea of Dallas Cowboys jerseys. The grill is always fired up, the air thick with the smell of sizzling burgers, and the coolers are stocked with Lone Star beer. We aren't bound by blood, but by something stronger: loyalty. The ugly red word that was once spray-painted on my front door is long gone, covered by a fresh coat of white paint. But I kept a picture of it. I have it saved in a folder on my phone, not as a reminder of the pain, but as a receipt. It's the price I paid for my freedom, and I look at it sometimes to remember how much that freedom is worth. With Grandpa's help, I used the inheritance my grandmother left me to start something in her name: the Eleanor Patel Memorial Scholarship. It's a small fund, administered through the local high school here in Oak Haven. Every year, it gives a grant to a student from a tough background who wants to build a future for themselves, either through military service or in a public service field like firefighting or nursing. I gave a short speech at the first award ceremony. I was more nervous standing at that podium than I ever was on patrol. I looked out at the young faces in the audience, and I told them the one thing I wish someone had told me. "Family," I said, my voice clear and steady, "are the people who invest in your potential, not the ones who demand a return on your success." My life at Fort Cavazos has changed too. I found I had a new mission, an unofficial one. I started mentoring the younger soldiers in my unit, the ones who were just kids, really, fresh out of basic training and overwhelmed by their first steady paycheck. I'd pull them aside and teach them how to read their LES, how to set up a savings plan, how to avoid the predatory lenders that circle every military base. I share parts of my story, not for sympathy, but as a warning. I teach them that financial independence isn't just about wealth. It's a form of self-defense. It's body armor for your life. I took the ugliest scar from my past and found a way to turn it into a shield for someone else. The story ends on a perfect Texas autumn evening. The air is crisp, the sun is setting in a blaze of orange and purple, and the sky is vast and clear. I'm sitting on my back porch, the same steps where my grandfather and I ate fried chicken in the dark. I'm nursing a cold beer, watching the people I love gathered in my yard. The big oak table is finally finished, and it's surrounded by my family. Mike Chen is at the grill, flipping burgers with the focus of a drill sergeant. My grandfather is telling a Wild War story to a young private who is hanging on his every word. My cousin's kids are chasing a lightning bug in the grass. The sound of their laughter is the best music I've ever heard. Looking at them, I realized the truth. I didn't lose a family. I escaped a prison, and then I found a real one. Family isn't just who you're born to. It's your squad. It's the people who have your six, no questions asked. It's the people who pull up a chair to the table that you built with your own 2 hands. In the quiet peace that I fought so hard to win, surrounded by the loyalty I had earned, I was finally truly home. My story found its peaceful ending here in Texas, but I know that for many of you, your own journey is still ongoing. What I've learned is that peace isn't something you're given, it's something you build, board by board, just like that big oak table. Your true family are the ones who show up with the tools and help you sand down the rough edges. If my story resonated with you, I'd be honored if you shared a piece of your strength in the comments below. For more stories about resilience and building your own dawn, please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you won't miss what's next. Thank you for listening. You are not alone.